And tonight's tale. If you're going to explore abandoned buildings, don't. Psychic circles, Ouija boards, tarot cards, and all the other objects of the metaphysical are followed with stories of danger. They should really come with warning labels that they're not meant to be handled by those without the experience or knowledge to deal with anything that might be let through. Stories to send chills down your spine may seem to be the norm when referencing such objects, usually from the elderly family members or the religious zealots that claim the instruments create a direct line to demonic entities or else forces of the darkest evils. The latter stories are quick to point out, of course, that you'll be plagued by spirits which, once invited in, cannot be rid of save in the most extreme of circumstances. Not all tales need to end with screaming, blood-covered survivors and broken mirrors. No, some of them just end dark and cold. My name is Cody Barnes. I am 15 years old, with blue eyes and reddish-orange hair. I like to skateboard and hang out with my friends. A normal kid, not really a troublemaker, though some of my friends definitely were. That didn't matter to me. I was just happy to have friends to hang out with. We would spend a lot of time together, hanging out around town with our birds, chilling out to music and smoking like the rebellious kids we were. Sure, pot was illegal, but it wasn't a hard drug, and we liked how it made us feel and how the conversations we would have when we were. And my best friend Jay put it, blazing it. He always talked like that, a real street rat skate punk. I always wished I could be that cool. And I had tried hard in school, and wanted to make something of myself. That didn't stop me from dressing like Jay and the rest of my friends though. Ripped black skinny jeans, skate shoes with laces, in the wildest patterns we could find. Snapbacks that never sat straight, and of course, overly large band t-shirts with a long sleeve tee underneath. Bonus points if the sleeves had writing on them. It didn't stop me from dishing class with him to go out behind the school and light up either, though the first few times it took a lot of convincing, and I wouldn't skip it if I had a test and we were starting a new segment or something. I would only skip once I knew I could do the work and understand what I needed to learn. I was still trying to be a good student. They couldn't stop me from making the worst decision of my life, though. When we weren't skipping class, we would hang out around the neighbourhood, and then eventually the whole city, once Jay had a car and could drive us all around. He was a year older than the rest of us in our little crew, because he had been held back a year in elementary school because of reading problems. Turned out he was dyslexic, and no one knew when he was younger. Schools just don't care, I guess. But he ended up with a slick yellow GT that his dad helped him buy, matching the money that he put in from his summer jobs. It wasn't brand new or anything, but man, was that thing awesome. Now that we had proper wheels, we could go anywhere. We used to go to the park across town that had some pavilions and a big parking lot and some trails out the back side on the edge of the city where it met the woods that the highway ran through out of our town. It was great to go for a blunt walk and then hang out on the swings or skate in the parking lot. We didn't have a skate park, but some of the other teenagers had built ramps and brought them up and left them there. I tried to build one myself once, but it wasn't a good quality by any means. I never showed it to any of the guys because I would get roasted pretty bad if I did. We would drag the ramps out and have a blast for a few hours as night would start to fall. Take a quick bath in body spray so our parents wouldn't smell the weed on our clothes, pass around the bottle of eye drops and head home. It was a good way to spend most days. Until Jay and Mike, another member of our little group, got the bright idea to start playing with some Zippo lighters they had picked up at a corner shop and set one of the pavilions on fire. It burned down. The police came and rounded them up after we all scattered, and they got charged with it. Nothing major, of course, just some probation. My parents were not happy when they found out, which they did really quickly, because the fire was in all the local papers. I wasn't allowed to hang out with Jay and Mike anymore. They didn't know Tim was there as well, so I was still allowed to see him. We'd tell them that I was going over to Tim's place. No, Ma, Jay and Mike won't be there. We don't hang out anymore. Yeah, I'll be home before 9. Of course, that was all lies. Trying to keep us from hanging out just led to the perfect excuse for us to hide the fact that we were hanging out. I would say I was going to Tim's place, and Tim would say that he was coming to my place. Of course, our parents never talked. We were teenagers. Teenagers' parents don't call to check up on their kids. Besides, we had cell phones for them to call and check up on us if they really needed anything. But on the whole, they were pretty trusting. After all, why wouldn't they be? I was a good kid, as far as they knew. And on the whole, I was a good kid. A lot of people knew Jay, though, so we had to be really careful where we hung out so we wouldn't get caught. This led, as you might expect, to us hanging out places where no one would think to look for us, and where it wasn't likely other people would show up. You guessed it, abandoned buildings. The city used to be a really big industrial centre in the early 1900s with a bunch of factories. As time progressed, a lot of those factories closed down. Some of the buildings were demolished and new housing units were erected in their place. Most of them were called the projects. There are some projects in the city that you don't go to. I remember hearing about a guy delivering a pizza to the Long Hill projects that got shot in the face just for being there to deliver the pizza. We weren't little gangsters or anything like that, just some skate kids, and had no interest in getting mixed up in anything like that at all. But even though some of the old buildings and factories were turned into these projects, a lot of them were just straight up abandoned. Windows long since boarded up, no trespassing signs plastered around, that kind of thing. These kinds of places are where we ended up hanging out a lot, smoking weed, skating across the old factory floors, hiding from our parents. Sometimes we'd even score a beer or two, or on rare occasion, a bottle of liquor. I really liked hanging out with my friends, but I never really liked hanging out in these places. Something about abandoned buildings really freaked me out. I would never say anything to the guys, though. I didn't want them to think I was scared, even though I was. I knew they'd have ribbed me endlessly. But there's always something eerie, you know? Lack of light, broken windows, boarded up exits, long hallways that disappeared into darkness. Like being locked in a giant empty tomb. I wasn't afraid of ghosts or anything that goes bump in the night. It was really just the empty buildings themselves that freaked me out. Seeing something so large that used to be teeming with life, now standing empty and hollow, was unnerving in some way. But I'd go in with the guys anyway, and not say anything about it. I would never wander off to explore or anything though, like they would sometimes. I'd always stay in the main room where we'd set up our stuff and hang out, and try to act like it didn't bother me. Skating through old machines or grinding on rusty old workbenches in the dust and gloom. It really didn't faze me more as we went on. Until the watch factory. That changed everything. The watch factory was smack dab in the middle of what used to be the old city centre, back when it was an industrial powerhouse. Now, though, this part of the city is mostly outside of everything else. There's really just a few little shops and a gas station. The metropolis had shifted away from this area of town. We had never been inside the watch factory because it was boarded up tight, with thick, wrought iron gates that were chained closed with huge padlocks. We might have climbed the fence if it weren't for the spike tops on the metal poles. Unlike the rest of the abandoned warehouses and buildings on this side of town, there wasn't a whole lot of graffiti on the watch factory. There were only 2 tags on its side. Someone had obviously gotten brave enough to scale the fence, despite the spikes, and leave their mark, and then a rival crew had to go in. But other than that, it was pretty clear. Jay used to talk about how cool it would be to be the first inside the watch factory, to set it up as our own little hangout spot, instead of having to share it with other groups or crews, since there were other teens like us that would hang out in the buildings that we used to frequent. But a place of our own, he said. Now that would be awesome. I never liked the look of the watch factory myself, and I didn't see why we'd need our own hangout place at all, since it's not like we were a gang, and I didn't see what was wrong with sharing our hangout spot. Sometimes others would show up and kick it, throw in some weed and a few beers, and it turned into a little party. I'm pretty sure that Tim felt the same way I did, since he never contributed much to these conversations besides, "Yeah man, would be awesome," or "maybe we could get like a mini fridge," only to be laughed at because a mini fridge would need power, and then he'd just get ribbed about being stupid. Mike was different. Well, he wasn't originally very into the idea of breaking into a new place to claim it for ourselves. He was always looking to please, and quickly got on board with the idea, at times becoming more enthusiastic about the idea than Jay himself. He'd bring it up a lot to get his attaboys from Jay. We didn't think anyone really liked Mike all that much, and we'd leave him out on purpose from time to time. But Jay loved Mike, so we accepted him anyway. We were a group of misfits, really, before Jay found us and brought us all together, and no one wanted to rock that boat. I definitely didn't. I knew I was different from them in a lot of ways, because I still cared about making something of myself, and I was lucky to just have friends. I only thought about it much later, that maybe it was the same for everyone else. They knew they didn't really fit in, but were just so grateful to finally have friends that they would have said and done anything. I've had a lot of time to think about that lately. But even though there was a lot of talk about breaking our way in, even a few ideas were floated about trying to steal some bolt cutters from an uncle's garage or something, that's all it was. Talk. We were never actually going to break in. I didn't want to catch a charge, as Jay would say. Trespassing was one thing, but breaking and entering, that was another. Tim agreed with me. But in order to assure our little crew of friends that we weren't chicken, we agreed emphatically that we would go in if it was open already. Little did we know that we would soon get our chance. There was a big storm that summer, and a tornado touched down briefly in some parts of the state. Whipping winds, fallen branches, downed power lines, the whole nine. The city was a wreck for a few days, but soon enough the town maintenance crews had everything righted and the power restored to the part of the city that lost power. The first night we got to hang out again after the clean-up is a night I'll never forget. As was the typical way of things, Tim and I met up together at the edge of the neighbourhood we shared, out of view of both of our houses, and walked down the hill towards the corner store. Jay picked us up, Mike already in the passenger seat, so Tim and I climbed in the back, and we started driving across town. It was pretty exciting, since Mike was holding already, and we weren't going to have to pick up anything before getting our skate on. Jay was unusually excited, with a huge smile on his face, and I figured it must be the energy drinks that we could see sitting empty in the cup holders on his centre console. It's funny sometimes, the things you remember, but I remember that little green sticker with a piece on it that was ripped in half on one of the cans, so it was only showing the part that read 99 cents. As we turned out the bottom of the hill and started heading towards the mostly deserted part of town, Jay finally told us why he looked like that cat, from the old cartoons, where it eaten that little yellow bird. "It's open," he said. "The wind knocked down the gate." He didn't need to elaborate any further, because we already knew what he meant, and Mike was already whooping excitedly from the passenger seat, just as hyped as Jay was. I looked at him, and he gave me a little half shrug that I knew meant we were going to have to go along with it, because we couldn't figure out a way out of the adventure that we were about to go on. I nodded back and joined in, with Tim speaking up as well, being stoked and excited about the watch factory finally being ours for the taking. Couldn't let them know that I didn't want to go inside. It only took about 10 minutes or so to reach the watch factory. Jay parked the car across the street in a parking lot that wasn't gated off, and we piled out of the GT. We stood around the car for a few minutes, smoking cigarettes and messing around, while Jay told us more about where the gate was down and what our plan was going to be. We would stay at the car, hanging out, and one by one, a couple of minutes after each other, cross the street and casually walk to the back side of the building, to where the gate was broken, he said. This way we wouldn't attract a bunch of suspicion, and anyone watching would think that we all just separated and went home or something. It would have been a good plan if it weren't for his bright yellow car sitting in an abandoned parking lot, surrounded by nothing but empty warehouses and factories, with no real businesses around to make it look like we might be inside shopping somewhere. But, oh well. Jay left first to make his way across the street and into the building, followed shortly after by Mike. That left Tim and I alone, and though we both thought, I'm pretty sure, that this was a bad idea, and we didn't want to go through with this, neither of us would say anything. Then it was his turn to head off, leaving me alone to spend a few minutes looking at my phone, pretending to be texting, before I walked off to join them. I really thought for a minute that I should text my mum and tell her that I decided to come down the hill for some food and didn't realise how far it was until I started back up the hill, and see if she could come and get me. I'd have to walk all the way across the city first, but it might be worth it. Just the thought of going into the watch factory filled me with a sense of dread and unease, unlike nothing that we had ever felt. Like nothing we would ever feel again, as it turns out. But of course, my friends would think that I was a coward. They would probably start leaving me out of things, like we did to Mike, and I didn't want that. So, after the 5 minutes had gone by, and it was my turn to cross the street, and head around behind the building. It's exactly what I did. It wasn't just a road, of course. It was a 2-laned state highway with concrete walls on the side that ran across most of the outer limits of the city. It wasn't very busy most days. You did have your time crossing, just so you wouldn't get smacked by a car. There weren't any traffic lights or stop signs or anything to prevent you from getting hit, but you could still make it across reasonably easily. It wasn't that hard. I ran across, then strolled as casually as I could along the sidewalk, heading towards the back side of the building, trying my best not to look at the water factory. Worries about breaking and entering aside, the building gave me a terrible feeling. Not only was it an abandoned building and inherently creepy, but the thought of being the first ones into this empty husk of a structure that had been sealed up like a vault for decades had me on edge. Who knew what could be in there? Dead bodies? A nest of rats that had rabies? Maybe it belonged to the mafia, and that's why no one had ever bothered to break in. I wanted nothing more than to keep walking right past that little alley, around the backside and away from the street. But I heard Mike whisper my name, calling me over as I got close, and I took a quick look around to make sure that there were no cars coming to see me as I ducked out over the street and headed in to meet my friends. We were standing around a section of the iron fence, about 15 feet or so away, the broken section of the fence. It was pretty well hidden from the road, and no one would see us, or at least that's what we hoped. This section of the fencing wasn't completely broken open. Rather, it looked like the metal bars had been pressed down with extreme force, inwards towards the building. The little metal pieces that went sideways to connect the individual bars together looked twisted in some places, and in others they were cut through, although not cleanly by any means. The wall wasn't fully laying down, having been knocked over, but the bars were bent forward, the spiked tops pointing not directly up at the sky anymore, but forward into a sort of 45-degree slope, the bars themselves making a kind of ramp that we could easily walk up. That was our ticket in. I thought it was weird that the storm could have done this, when there was another building directly behind us to block the wind, and only this small section of fence had been affected at all. The tornado hadn't touched down in our city, or even on the outskirts of it. In fact, it had made land about 50 miles away. Nothing in this section of town seemed to have been any worse for the wear after the storm. From looking at the fence, it was pretty obvious that someone had just come by and kicked the fence in or something. If Tim and Mike had the same thought, they didn't say anything, and neither did I. We just followed Jay, smiling hugely, his eyes glinting with excitement and criminal mischief, as he jumped up on the broken fencing and reached a hand down to help the next one of us up. Without too much time to think, we were all over the fence and officially on watch factory property. The poured cement beneath our feet was all broken up in spots from the obvious lack of maintenance. Deep ruts full of pebbles that probably held gallons of water when it rained peppered the parking lot that ran along the side of the building, and was run through with cracks like veins leading from the factory itself. Definitely no code for skating. The windows were all boarded up tight, with no gaps that I could see, just big plywood pranks covering the windows from what we could see on the ground level. All the doors, I knew from our times of driving by, were locked shut with giant metal padlocks. I wasn't sure how we were going to get inside. Jay led the way confidently, though. Either he knew exactly where he was going, or was just making a show of not being worried about our ability to get inside. But we followed along behind him, in the shadow cast by the other building, and up some big cement steps, into a little back door. There was no chain or lock here, just a door handle sat in one of those metal plates. It looked oddly dark, like someone had tried to burn their way in, like the metal had been scorched. Above the door handle, and somewhat near the door jamb, was a series of dents and scratches, as if it had been forced open with a crowbar at some point. Jay put his hand on the handle and made a big show of trying to force the door open. It opened way easier than it should have, and Jay turned around to us with a huge smile, expecting us to eat up his showmanship and the miraculous way that he had pushed the door open. So, eat it up we did. There were quiet whoops of congratulations from us, and enthusiastic claps on the back, and all of the other things that you can imagine teenagers say after some stupid, small feat of petty crime had been accomplished. It was obvious to me that Jay must have come up earlier on and broken in the gate, kicking it down, and crowbarring his way through the door. I was pretty sure it was obvious to the other quiz as well, but we let it pass and said nothing, and followed Jay, now nearly bouncing with glee up the steps and through the door. The door opened into a long, wide, open room that seemed big enough to take up the whole base of the building from the outside. If there were side rooms or anything, they must have been small, because its size seemed just about right. There were support columns here and there that held up the next floor, and right in the middle was a giant, open stairwell. The place was lit from the light, coming through the boarded up windows, which apparently weren't as airtight as they looked from the outside. We could see pretty well, actually. Along the floor, here and there, scattered about all the dust and dirt, were some rusted steel rails that looked like they would be perfect for grinding. Along the outside walls were some benches that might have been workbenches at one point, and an old punch clock with some kind of folders in a metal rack above it. I had to hand it to Jay. It was pretty much the perfect hangout. The ceiling was high enough that we didn't have to worry about hitting our heads if we were kicking up. Jay was already wandering about, pointing out places along the ground where he wanted to set up ramps that we were going to build. Mike and Tim started talking about getting some posters and spray paint to decorate the inside walls of the place as we followed Jay around. Even my own unease was starting to lessen as the excitement of having our own little indoor skate park started to set in, even if my eyes did not wander too close to the stairs that made their way up to the second floor. I really didn't want to go up there where the offices probably used to be. I tried not to think about it. As we circled up to smoke our first in our new hangout, I pointed myself so that my back wasn't to the stars, but still kept my eyes away from it. We got on our boards after that and tore it up, or at least that's what we felt like we were doing. Who knows if we were actually good skaters? It didn't matter. We could do a few tricks, grind a couple of rails and tables, and feel totally badass. When the light coming through the windows started to fade a bit, and we knew the sun was starting to set, we decided to stop skating, and were debating whether or not we should smoke again before going home, when Jay decided we should explore the second floor. I was horrified, and tried to make like it was getting late and I had to be home before my parents got suspicious. After all, we could totally explore upstairs tomorrow, I said. Tim jumped in too, saying it was getting late and he had to be home. Mike, though, ever on board with Jay's stupid ideas, was all gung-ho about the idea and started making his way towards the stars at once. Jay hadn't moved, clearly torn for a moment between wanting to get us home before he got in trouble and exploring as was his wont. If it hadn't have been for what Mike said next, we might have all made it home safely. But no, he had to open that big, stupid mouth of his. Jay drove, so we leave when he's ready. That simple phrase ignited something in Jay. He straightened up from the usual casual lean he always had and nodded with a quick, "Yeah, that's right," attitude, and made his way towards the stars. "We'd just have a quick look around," he said, and then he'd take us home. So, up the stairs we went, birds tucked under our arms, and followed our fearless leader up into the dark. With every step, I tried to tell myself it was nothing to worry about, just some old, empty offices, and that my fear of abandoned buildings was completely irrational. Hurt in my throat by the time I reached the top, I looked out to survey the second floor of the watch factory. To my surprise, it was not a bunch of offices like I had imagined, but rather a second wide warehouse space, like the floor below had been. The wooden floor was covered in dust and dirt and crime, and who knows what else. Throughout the centre of the room stood what I guess must have been an old assembly line, with heavy steel rollers that looped around in an oval throughout most of the room. It was dusty and dirty and had random bits of old papers stuck in it here and there. Jay's face lit up. We simply had to skate over the top of it and make a full loop before going home, he said, pulling his own board out from under his arm and setting it on top of the rollers nearby. Before we knew it, he had climbed up onto the rollers, and then onto his board, and he was off. The rollers let out a horrible, screeching sound as he pounded against them with his foot to get any kind of movement out of them. But once he had built up some momentum, he flew around the oval and then jumped off onto the wooden boards of the floor in front of us with a pretty impressive kickflip. Beaming and triumphant, he pointed at Mike, who took his board without hesitation and jumped up for his turn around the oval. I shook my head, watching. At least it wouldn't take too long, and we'd be gone soon. Unlike the downstairs, the floor did not have many windows, so it wasn't that bright. In fact, it was not light at all. The dark half of the oval was almost completely shrouded in darkness, to the point where, when watching Mike, he disappeared from view as he rounded the far edge and reappeared a few seconds later. The darkness, the emptiness, the hollowness of the building seemed to grow in that far dark corner, I remember thinking, as if everything that his factory no longer was, the absence of any light and life, was compressed and crammed and smashed up together into that corner in an effort to make something from the nothingness that had become the building's existence. Mike returned from his loop, the rollers and stand slowly stopping their screeching and grinding sounds, and got off, looking at Shay for approval. The way his face lit up when Jay gave him the nod was something I've never forgotten, even after all this time. And then it was Tim's turn. Looking like he was swallowing his discomfort so we could all just go home. He walked up to the conveyor belt and put his bird on the rollers, then climbed up himself. The floor gave a groan, and the metal gave another loud screech as he mounted up. But then he kicked off and was off, making his way around the oval of metal, heading towards the corner of emptiness. As Jay and Mike watched him, I watched the floor and the way it seemed to buckle slightly under his weight as he made his way around. Tim wasn't a heavy guy or anything. The floor was just old. When he disappeared into the darkness at the edge of the oval, I found myself holding my breath until he reappeared. He dismounted, slowly. No fanfare, no ta-da moment. Just a quiet nod of his head that said, "There, that's done." And then it was my turn. I made a half-hearted attempt to point out that the floor was clearly rotten and showing signs of collapse. But the ribbing started in fast and did not let up. I couldn't let the guys think I was a coward. So I swallowed hard and put my board up. We climbed up onto the rails as gently as I could, wincing at the sound of the groaning wood and the screeching warning of the rusted metal. As I kicked off for the first time, I watched a shower of rust dust trail from the bottom of my shoe. That struck me as weird as I took off. The rollers underneath my wheels started to turn with the momentum of the wheels on my board, and in a few moments I was zipping around the room, support fillers flashing by in blurry flashes of light and colour. For a moment, I was just exhilarated by the feeling of speeding along, and I didn't even think about entering the darkness. That is, until I went into it. The air itself felt of nothing. It wasn't hot or cold or anything. It felt of a nothingness so complete and intense that the absence of its existence made my skin crawl and goosebumps prick up on my arms. My lungs emptied, like when I had been sucker punched in the stomach last summer, instead replaced by a vacuum of darkness. My eyes did not see the pitch black of a completely unlit room. They simply did not see anything at all. Not a blindness, but something deeper and more insidious. There was nothing to see, not even the nothingness itself. Panicked, I tried to draw breath into my lungs, but I only managed to suck in more of the creeping, insidious nothing that was pressing around me. It was seeping in through my ears. You know how you feel pressure before your ears pop, and there's that weird kind of reverse pressure seeping in and out well before your ears feel normal again? It was like that, only my ears did not pop, and I was experiencing both the building and slow leaking of pressure through my head all at the same time. The same thing was happening to my eyes. The indistinct tendrils of nothingness forcing their way in around my eyes, climbing up through my nose and flooding my nasal passages. And when I breathed in, the nothing flooded down my throat and into my lungs like a tidal wave. My head swam and I lost balance, leaning to the right as I struggled to regain my balance, my arms kicked out behind me and wheeling in the air as I tried to regain my stance on the board and remain upright. But I had tilted too far off my centre, and at last I felt the bird shoot out, from under my feet as I went. I remember bracing to hear the screeching of the metal rollers, but it never came. Or maybe it did, and my head and lungs were so full of that smoke that wasn't smoke, that it was drowned out by the vacuum slowly taking over my whole body. A sharp thud into my back sent the gaseous nothingness out of my lungs and nose with such force that my eyes popped open, and I felt the tears leaking from the corner of them. In an instant, we was back to the real world again, in all its vibrant colours and sounds. I tried to turn my head to look around at where I was, but I could only move it a little bit. Panicked, I tried to sit up, and then to kick my legs, move an arm, anything. But the nothingness might have spread to my limbs. I couldn't feel my body. It wasn't a numb, tingling sensation. You know, that one you get when your arm falls asleep after you've been laying on it for an hour. It was just gone. I heard shuffling feet and a few sounds from somewhere above me, and I couldn't move my head to see who was shouting at me. I blinked a few times to clear the tears out of my eyes and get a better look at whatever I could see. The air around me was thick with dust and particles of rust, shimmering in the air after having been disturbed, and the smell of old sawdust filled my nostrils. We could see, just a few inches away from my nose, an old, broken wooden beam that looked like it had been cut in half when it landed on a steel rail. Debris and wood chips were everywhere, and there, just out of the corner of my eye, was a massive, rusty steel roller. We realised then what had happened, and with all the effort that I could muster, managed to turn my head up towards the ceiling to see the gaping hole, its edges pointed and jagged, where the wooden beams that had rotted out and given way, crashing down with me in a shower of wood and metal and rust, bringing a large chunk of the conveyor with it. The floor had finally collapsed, and me along with it. From somewhere down near my feet, I heard voices and the sounds of running shoes, but I could not see anyone. A moment later, Jay's face came into view, and then it was replaced by Tim's. He was unusually pale looking. I remember that. An ambulance, one of the voices suggested. They should call 911. No, another voice said. The police would nail everyone. Tim's face reappeared. We could tell he was speaking quickly, with the way his eyes were wild and rushed, but his words entered my sluggish brain slowly, each syllable stretching out until it seemed almost like the whale songs my mother used to play in my room while I slept as a kid. They were going to call the 911 from the old payphone down the street, one of the few that was still left working in the city. They would say that they were walking by and saw a bunch of smoke and stuff come from the building, and they should send an ambulance. Tim gave me a smile that was equal parts sadness and apology. Jay called to him, and he turned away for a moment to respond. Then he turned back to me once more. He didn't say anything. At least, I don't think he did. He just looked me in the eye for a long moment, and then he was gone. I just laid there, staring up at the gaping hole into the second floor. I had a good view of the dark corner that had filled me with so much unease before, but I didn't have the strength to turn my head away again. I wondered how long it would take them to make it to the payphone. I was too tired to close my eyes, even though I did not want to see the darkness of the abandoned building. The pressure that had built up in my limbs from the nothingness that had taken it over began, ever so slowly, to ease. Like when my ears popped on the airplane that we took that trip to Disney when I was 5. I could feel that horrible nothingness starting to drain away, leaving behind a cold that was unlike anything we had ever experienced. It was a sharp, icy cold. It was not a sharp, icy cold that made me shake and shiver, like when I had spent all day sledding with my sister and fell through the ice of a little puddle that drenched my clothes. It was deeper than that, more persistent. It wasn't a cold that you could brace against. It simply was, all-consuming and encompassing. I wondered how long it would take the ambulance to arrive after they called. The light that had streaked in through the boarded windows from the street lamps was fading, and it was getting darker. Stupid city. Half the streetlights were always out. Dark and cold. Just my luck. I think I'm hallucinating in the dark. It is really cold for summertime. I saw Jay's face reappear again, or at least I think I did. Not as much time must have passed since Tim said that they were leaving as I thought. Jay's eyes were bright, the brightest thing in the room, glinting off whatever light remained, and his smile, those big perfect teeth, seemed to be showing less doofy as it usually did, and less harmless than usual. He must be worried about what was going to happen to me. Panicked, like Tim had looked. Then he was gone. It was dark again, the darkness closing in, and cold, so cold. I wondered how long it would take them to get help, and why they hadn't left yet. It was like waking up on Christmas morning before your parents are awake, and sitting in the dark of the living room, looking at all those presents under the tree, but it had to wait before waking up your parents, because it was too early. I missed the way those little lights in the tree would twinkle, and I wondered if we would ever get a chance to see them again. Jay's face reappeared. Had they really not left for help yet? He leaned over me, the deranged smile looming into my vision. And then, for just a moment, all the colour and light returned to the world for a brilliant instant of pain as the knife plunged into my chest. I felt it enter between my ribs and pierce my lung. I felt it as it was withdrawn, the darkness replacing the entire world. I've been laying here in the cold. That is everything. It's worse than that horrible nothingness and the darkness. They should have made it to the phone booth by now, to make the call for the ambulance, I think. Soon, the medics will come for me. I haven't seen or heard anything until you started talking to me. Can you call an ambulance, just in case they haven't made it to the phone booth yet? Can you help me? You have to help me. I don't want to be in the dark. I don't want the cold. Help me! Help me! I moved the wooden planchard from the bottom of the board, where the word "goodbye" was clearly etched into the old wood, before lifting it off the board and flipping it over to rest on the table and pushing my chair back. This was not, of course, the first time that I had conversed with a spirit on my Ouija board, and I was well accustomed to the practice. Once one gets over the eeriness that is some unseen force communicating to you from the afterlife, there are a few things left to shock you. At least, that has been my experience. We had never had an encounter of some such object, quite like the one that I had with Cody, and I was shaken to my very core. We stood and crossed to the bedroom window that looked out over the driveway. The sun was just starting to set, and my husband would arrive home soon from work any minute now. We carefully wrapped up my bird and blanchard, oils, crystals, and candles, and packed them away into their little box, stowing them in the bottom of the closet that we shared, and then made my way to the kitchen to see about making some dinner. We had just crossed to the kitchen window when I saw my husband pull into the driveway. His yellow Mustang, parked just behind my own, little Accord.